Okay. You're all going deaf. That's good. I don't think there are any questions, mate. So that's it. Good.
John, does it help to have like a chair? Because you used to like put your leg up.
An armchair would be good, yeah. Rocking chair. I think there was one that I saw in writing last night. We start off with that one.
Yesterday you talked about how Solomon blessed the people, and then it's the people that they bless Solomon. What does that mean? How do we bless the Lord? Is that the same word, blessing, as he blesses us?
It's a funny word, isn't it, blessing? And a bit confusing. I mean, it's a word that hasn't directly got explicit content. I mean, it's good. You'd rather be blessed than cursed, right? So it's positive. It's all positive, but the actual positive content isn't contained in the word. Because I saw it beforehand, I was able to think about it a little bit. There are two Bible words that come into English as bless, and they're really quite different, so it's just worth being aware of that. There's in Hebrew the word ashrei that you get at the beginning of Psalm 1. Blessed is the man, right? And so some of the translations translate that with happy. It's a bit feeble. But that isn't a word of that man is blessed in the other sense. Blessed is the man, it means something like, oh, how fortunate is the man. One of the studies I read of that word came up with the paraphrase of its meaning of, oh, how enviable. But because of envy brings in other issues, I don't think that quite gets it. But it's a different word. That's the word that comes into Greek as makarios. It's the word in the Beatitudes. Oh, how fortunate are those who mourn. That's how you get the paradox of Jesus' word. Why? Because they will be comforted. Right, so that's one sort of strain of our English word bless, which probably not a particularly helpful translation, especially if it's confused with the barak words bless. That's the one that we've encountered in our 1 Kings 8. The barak is God blesses. That's the blessing word in Genesis 1. And best I can see, that describes between two parties a profound expression and action of goodwill. I can't get it. I can't really tease it out any better than this, but it works both ways. So God blesses us. What's our response? We bless God. But the content can't be the same, can it? From the superior to the inferior, and the inferior to the superior. But it's this a deep expression of goodwill. God's goodwill He blesses us. He's good towards us. And I think, just trying to get the sense of the context, for us to bless Him includes, it's probably a bigger idea, but includes just thankfulness. We bless Him. We likewise have an attitude of goodwill towards the God who has blessed us. And so on that day in Jerusalem that we were looking at, there was just blessing everywhere, you see. God's goodwill. God had blessed the people and they knew it. And the king blessed the Lord. He was so thankful and full of joy and gratitude towards God for blessing them. The people blessed the king. Wow, what a king we've got. Their goodwill towards the king. And the king blessed the people. So everybody's blessing everybody else. It was a pretty happy time. But you get the idea of the word. It's sort of this wonderful goodwill towards one another. And if you sort of think of it in terms of, it's either from a superior to an inferior, then it's got one sort of connotation. When it's from an inferior to a superior, it's a little bit of a different connotation. You're still an inferior, and you're not actually doing anything that the superior needs, but the same kind of goodwill, an echo, if you like, of the goodness that you've received. I think it's a wonderful idea, but a little bit difficult to translate. That's the barak blessing word. Anyone want to follow that up with a comment or question? Take it further? Okay? I bless you. I'm very grateful to you. Really grateful for this weekend, actually, or this week. I'll take questions in just a minute, but if you guys have been involved in things like this, I can confess to you the last couple of weeks I could have done with anything but this week. Just in preparation, trying to get ready. And I was pretty worried about whether 1 Kings would be helpful or not. I thought, the temple, what have I chosen that for? So Moya's had me really grumpy for the last week or so. I wasn't grumpy about coming, really. It wasn't that. But being here has been a great blessing and a terrific encouragement, friends. Thank you for the encouragement of the work you guys and girls. Can guys be generic? Yeah, you guys, and I'm not being exclusive, you guys are doing, it's so encouraging to see the work you're doing so faithfully and often, very often in situations that don't give you a whole lot of encouragement. It's easy. It's sort of easy. It's not actually easy to be faithful when you're full of encouragement surrounding you all the time. Interestingly, those are the situations in which people trip up more often, actually. But to see you faithful when, and for many of you it's really hard. It's a terrific encouragement. Thank you for having me with you. I've really, really enjoyed being here. Now I'm saying I wouldn't have missed it for anything. Okay. Questions? Steve? I don't know whether you want to start, whether I want you to start with the easiest one or the hardest. Anyway, whatever you want to start with, go on. There's a good reason for that, but I won't go into it. Okay. We were discussing this over breakfast. All right. Are there limits or controls on typology? Well, yeah, but they're not sort of scientific. The way I put it over in a chat we're having over breakfast was it's more an art than a science, I think. That is, those of us who are sort of engineering inclined, we'd like rules and regulations and just, when it works and when it doesn't work, when it's excluded. And so, yeah, I don't think it quite works like that. It's more beautiful than that. How do I help it? So there's a thing we call typology and there's a thing we call allegory. And in general discussions of these things, allegory is bad, typology is good. It's not all that easy to actually spell out what's the difference between allegory and typology, except typology is when it's legitimate and allegory is when it's not. But it's basically, it's the same sort of thing. It's drawing a correspondence between things. There is a framework within which you're working. So the whole Bible story is from promise to fulfilment. And every part of the story, every part of the prophecy, every part of the poetry, every part of the Proverbs is got to do with that story. It's quite right wherever you are in the whole Old Testament story. It says, what's this got to do with the promise that was made to Abraham and that was fulfilled in Jesus? Now, I was in a part of the story that was really easy. It was very obvious. And in that story, it's the story of God at work in faithfulness to his promise. So it's got God's fingerprints on it all the way along. And it's not at all surprising that when God does something in faithfulness to his promise, it looks a little bit like what he does finally in fulfillment of his promise, because it's God doing the same things. You see that. Now, the things that really help you a lot is when the New Testament explicitly picks up those parallels. So it was easy for me, son of David and temple. Right, well, they're picked up in the New Testament. We didn't elaborate it fully, but the New Testament sees the temple fulfilled in three ways. They're interrelated, but Jesus himself, the church, and the individual believer are all described in the New Testament as a temple. And when temple language is used of those three realities and their interrelationship, it's perfectly obvious to me that they're saying they're using the temple that you're familiar with from the days of Solomon. It's not just an abstract idea of temple that's being used as a metaphor. It's that idea that's being taken over. So that's typology. Here's Solomon's temple, and it is an anticipation. That's one word you can use. You can use the New Testament word of a shadow, whatever word you want to use. But it's something like, and unlike, but it's something like the reality that has now come with Christ. Now that's typology, and you can see Son of David when Jesus is called the Son of David. I don't think I'd really noticed this till I had a good look at Solomon. I think we're saying he's like Solomon, because Solomon was the first son of David. Now here is the ultimate son of David. And then I find myself thinking about how was Jesus like Solomon? And the whole theme of Jesus' wisdom is so important and so rich, and I hadn't thought about it a lot. I just thought, oh, Jesus is wise. Of course he's wise. He knows everything. He's got to be wise. No, the wisdom of Solomon, he was given by God wisdom to do justice. That's the wisdom he was given. He was given wisdom to put the universe right in his little kingdom. Jesus has the wisdom to put everything right. See those parallels. And within that framework, you can see all sorts of things. And I'm sorry to be so terribly imprecise, but you've got to think carefully and see if it feels right. I'm a touchy-feely guy, you see. But there are parallels that feel forced and a bit artificial. That's when I think you're getting into the allegory kind of thing. Allegory is where you try to find a significance in every single detail. Much better, I think, to have the broad brush. There's this parallel between the temple, yes, the building work and Jesus' building work, the son of David, and there'll be a whole lot of things around that framework that will make sense. Excuse me. Now that's a relatively easy part, I think, of the Old Testament story to do that, but you can do exactly the same thing elsewhere. When you understand and get that the story is about every little bit of the story, even Esther, okay? Famously, God isn't mentioned. Every part of the Old Testament is part of the movement from promise to fulfilment, and therefore the lines can be noticed. But I don't think I can give rules as to how you do that. Certainly take very careful notice of whenever the New Testament explicitly makes a link for you. That can be a terrific guideline. But you can find yourselves in part of the Old Testament story when there are no explicit things in the New Testament. But you've learnt the... Oh, thanks, mate. You've learnt the pattern and the structure enough that you'll be able to see stuff. Anyone want to press that further? That'd be helpful. Stay on topic for a minute on that topic. It's really a very important one. The basic question for any Old Testament passage is what has this got to do with the promise made to Abraham? Then, what has it got to do with the fulfilment, the ultimate fulfilment of the promise that God gave to Abraham? And that's the framework in which we think. Yep. It's called an allegory in the text, isn't it? Yeah, I think that's a different meaning of the word allegory. The question is the Hagar-Sarah discussion in Galatians 4. Is it Galatians 4? Yeah. Is called an allegory there. I think that Paul's use of the word allegory is different from this sort of technical use of the word in biblical interpretation. And I'm sorry I can't take that any further. I'd really have to have a close look at Galatians 4, which isn't in my head at the moment. But one of the things just to be careful of is not taking terms that are used within the Scriptures and terms that are used in technical biblical interpretation literature. Same with mythology. So myths in the New Testament, just be careful. I mean, it could be the same, But when the New Testament talks about myths, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing that modern people mean by the word myth. So there's terms like that I'd just be very careful with. Yeah. Chris?
Just talking about the typology, in Africa we were wondering about the role that Solomon seems to take about priesthood. That he seems to be acting in a priestly way.
Yep.
And at other times that's kind of frowned upon.
Yeah.
By God when a king acts as a priest.
Where is it frowned upon? You're right. But just to remind us where it's frowned upon. It's frowned upon with Saul.
We heard about it with Saul.
Yep.
There was some discussion about whether that was accurate, whether it was actually that he just waited that he could
Yeah.
not that he's acting as a priest.
That's possible too. Yeah. Yes.
But yeah, a bit later on, I can't remember. The kings get
King oversteps the mark. Certainly with David, and I think with Solomon, you've got a king whose place in God's heart is so explicit. You see, David, some of you probably know this, David is a man after God's own heart, which means he's a man of God's choice. Doesn't mean he's a godly man, it means he's a man of God's choice. God set his heart on David. That little phrase that has become cliched in Christian circles is generally turned on its head. A man after God's own heart is a man on whom God has set his heart, rather than a man whose heart is set on God. It's about David's place in God's heart, not God's place in David's heart, right? So David is a different category altogether to Saul. And what will this king, who's God's king, who said, I have chosen for myself a king, God says of him, what will he do that Saul may not have been able to do? Saul was just, God gave them the king they asked for and said, let's see how it goes. If he's obedient, that'll be all right. If he's not, he's out. That was the terms of Saul's appointment. But David's appointment was a different kettle of fish altogether. And therefore, you do find David rightly, it's quite clear that the narrators are thoroughly approving of his activity in sacrificing and acting like a king and a priest at various points. And I think that spills over to Solomon. Some of the commentators are so annoying, aren't they? You find commentators, keep reading them, it can be helpful, but probably anyone who writes a commentary is annoying. Solomon gets such a rough treatment from particularly the modern commentators. They say, there's no indication that he was God's choice. It was God's choice in... Of course there was. When he was born, what happened when Solomon was born? What happened? Nathan came, gave him a name, said the Lord loved him, gave him a special name, Jedediah, loved of the Lord. If that isn't a clear indication that Solomon is God's choice to succeed David, I don't know what would be. It's remarkable, of course, given the circumstances of Solomon's birth and so on. So Solomon is very explicitly and clearly a king like David. He is the son of David. He is the promised son of David in an important sense. He fails very badly, and everything goes downhill from there. So subsequent kings, I don't think, have quite the same shine. And when they overstep the mark, there's just a difference between those two kings and every subsequent king. Some of them, of course, are reforming kings, and the Josiahs and the Hezekiahs and so on. But those two stand out. They're the two that, yeah. Yes.
Here is the king priest shadowing of Jesus, who is the king priest.
Yes. Exactly. So it might... Yeah, I've got no problem with that. Yeah, thanks, Chris. So saying we will see the parallels, we'll see the correspondence between the Old Testament king and priest at the high point, much better than we'll see it at the low point. At the low points, we'll see a contrast. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. It really is quite remarkable when you start to see how all these lines come to coalesce in the person of Jesus. A whole lot of different ways. So everything you got in the Old Testament that took that couple of thousand years for it all to happen, and it all gets coalesced in Jesus. It's almost as though the book's inspired, really. We're still on typology by the sound of it. Yeah, go.
Maybe just comment a little bit more about the character of Solomon, because so even in this 5 books, it seems that there's still some quite intense sinfulness, making marriage alliance with Egypt, sacrificing in non-sanctioned places.
Yeah. Read it carefully. I think that's right. I think the general point is right, that in Solomon's reign there are hints of cracks already, but they're not all cracks. So he sacrificed at the high places before the temple was built. Now, sacrificing at the high places is quite a hard issue to work out, but you go back and you find out Israel sacrificed at high places quite a lot before the temple was built. And it wasn't always wrong. Sacrificing at the high places of the pagans, that was a different matter. They were not to do that. That's clear in Deuteronomy. They're not to sacrifice at the places or in the manner of the pagans that they're driving out. But stuff seemed to happen at high places. It's not explicitly authorised, but it's not explicitly condemned. It is. Once there's a temple, then it is condemned on every occasion. So there's a mention of Solomon doing that at the beginning of chapter 3. It's complicated. My chapter on that little paragraph, I called it, "It's Complicated," on the beginning of chapter 3. It's not obvious to me that that's a criticism of him. Indeed, he goes to Gibeon, one of the greatest of the high places, and that's where the Lord appears to him. It doesn't seem to be criticised for going to Gibeon. Everything's good about that. So, yeah, you might be a hint. And certainly there is by the time you get to chapter 11. By the time you get to chapter 11, he's going up to all sorts of high places and building temples for all these pagan wives. Chapter 11, there really is a problem. But don't read back the problems, which is what a lot of the commentaries tend to do. They see Solomon as a flawed figure at almost every point, a compromised figure. I don't think the narrator is doing that. The marriage alliance with Pharaoh's daughter, certainly Solomon's marriages are a problem. Chapter 11. That marriage, again, it's introduced in chapter 3, and it's just got this ambiguity about it. It may have an upside and a downside. It might be like that. But the fact that Solomon, and he's calling the tune, has a marriage alliance with Egypt, of all things, and actually it's not a marriage alliance, that's a mistranslation. It is, he became Pharaoh's son-in-law. It's exactly the same vocabulary as David became Saul's son-in-law, right? So, yes, there was a marriage, but the idea of it being a marriage, an alliance and a contractual treaty or something like that is not really there. He became Pharaoh's son-in-law, and it was his initiative. So who's now ruling over Egypt? Who has the influence over Egypt? Now, there's a turnabout. And the story of Solomon's reign at 2 or 3 points explicitly says this is a story you've got to understand by going back to the Exodus. This is where the story that began with the Exodus now reaches its conclusion, and its conclusion is somehow or other with Solomon, what do we call it, influence over the mighty Pharaoh of Egypt. So it's not, at every point in Solomon's story, you've got to read carefully, not jump to the conclusion. I think there are indications of cracks and weaknesses. So Solomon's not the perfect king, and just as, of course, David wasn't. And as you see those cracks, they're reminders that you're looking at a shadow. You're not looking at the real thing. We can't actually have arrived yet. And the narrator seems to be, or of course he's aware that we haven't arrived yet because he's aware of the subsequent history as well. You're itching to say something more. Well, I'm sorry to keep saying this. It's complicated. Because the nations that they were forbidden to intermarry with were explicitly the nations that they were driving out of the land, and they're listed, and Egypt isn't one of them. So whether there was a problem, and if you look at the treatment of Pharaoh's daughter, married to Solomon, through the first 11 chapters, she gets mentioned several times, and she's actually distinguished in chapter 11 from the other ones. Almost, so the problem with Solomon, he married all these foreign women in addition to marrying Pharaoh's daughter. Is Pharaoh's daughter one of the foreign women that were the problem, or is it the other foreign women that he married that were the problem? It's sort of that particular alliance. Anyway, I don't want to make too much of that, but I think that the reversal of the Egypt relationship is part of the story. It's a subtle part of the story, but okay, we're getting into too much detail there. I think, brother, you okay? More on typology? Yeah, brother.
Yeah, in our group we noted that Jesus is fulfillment of prophet, priest and king. Jesus intercedes for us and is our mediator. Different functions, just to comment on him as our interceder and our mediator. The one who intercedes and the one who mediates.
Distinction between intercession and mediation?
Yeah.
I've got no idea. Anybody got any suggestions on that? Off the top of my head, I would have thought intercession was an aspect of mediation, but I don't know. Anybody? I haven't thought about that. It sort of seems to me to be either word seems to be appropriate to a priestly function. Were you thinking something different?
It just came up in our group.
Yeah.
Think about how Jesus fulfills certain roles.
Yeah.
Prophet and priest.
And, you know, the work of Jesus mightn't fit neatly into those three categories, which we traditionally, and I think very helpfully, employ to describe Jesus, prophet, priest and king. But you don't actually get that phrase anywhere in the Scriptures. The categories are there at various points, but can he neatly be put into those three categories and every aspect of his work put into one or the other? I mean, an intermediary role, the prophet would be an intermediary role as well. But then the prophet prays, so the prophet intercedes. So I wouldn't try to divide the roles up too much. And my thinking about what mediation means, it means a lot of things. Mediation goes both directions, I suppose. God towards us, represents God to us, represents us to God. And the focus on the latter is in the word intercession, I suppose. Yeah. Steve, do you want to go number two? Number one took us for a while. Brian, you'll interrupt us when we should stop, won't you? Yep. Oh, it's so flat it's not there. I mean, you don't call it a sea, do you, when it's all flat? No waves. Nothing to catch. I think, you see, the sea in its normal state is a threat. The sea is raging and God, when God rules over the sea, it becomes calm and still. And I think that saying there's no sea is just a way of saying there is no more raging threat. I think. Anybody who done some work on Revelation got further insights on that? I think it's the sea as threat that is no more. And it would seem to me to be saying exactly the same thing. I'll just go out there and put it exactly the same thing as saying a sea like crystal. You know, as calm as crystal is the same as no sea at all, I think. Yeah? Is that right? Yep. Yes. No, I'm no expert on the book of Revelation. Sorry, purely off the top of my head, so it's worthless. I would think it was the same sort of point being made. It's all, there's no threat anymore from the sea. God's rule has now brought peace, complete peace. That's what I would think. But somebody who's done some more work on Revelation, there could well be a movement from the sea of glass to the no sea at all, but I don't know what it is. Yeah. Anything else? You're not allowed to ask any more questions about Revelation. Steve, keep going. You don't have to stand up, mate, just shout. Yep. In my opinion, they are closely related. So the king who is being given wisdom to do justice, that finds an aspect of its wonderful fulfilment in justification. You're fully aware, of course, that the word righteousness could be translated justice. So it never is, but it could be. It is in some contexts in the New Testament, but in it the justice of God is revealed. In the gospel, the justice of God is revealed. It would be a perfectly acceptable translation, although you need to unpack what you mean by justice. And you see that, don't you, later in chapter 3 of Romans, where he is just and the justifier of him who has faith in Jesus. The main problem with the righteousness translation is you don't see that it's the same word as justification. So righteousness, they're all plays on the same word in Pauline discussion. So yeah, I think that it's perfectly right to reflect on this king who is given by God the wisdom to do justice. And you see what, I just love the Psalm 72 exposition of that justice. It's big, it's cosmic. In your personal experience as a believer, it's when you are put right. When you are put right with God, justly, believe it or not. How does that happen? Goodness me, that would be divine wisdom that could pull that off, wouldn't it? And it is. Yeah. So yeah, I'd see that all a part of a theme. Yep. You want to take that any further?
Can I just ask?
Yeah.
In terms of living that out as Christians, though, to do justice, to be righteous, is that everything?
Yeah. One of the we've got a huge problem with this, haven't we? Because we're surrounded by a pagan, just use that word just to be emotive, but a pagan concept of justice in our world. And it requires some really careful thought by Christian people, I think. You don't just jump on board with a movement because it has the word justice attached to it and say, oh, well, we got to back that. I think we do have to back genuine justice, but we got to think about what justice is. Putting things right, real wrongs in the world. I think that we ought to be supportive of any efforts to right wrongs. But just to put it, to go political for a minute, an inequality is not an injustice, right? Necessarily. Some inequalities will be. But an inequality is not necessarily an injustice. And so the movements today for where equality and justice are almost identical concepts, and that I think, I don't know anything about this, why am I saying anything, but the notion of social justice, that little phrase, social justice, I don't want to throw baby out with bathwater. We've got to be very, very careful here and don't just become redneck right-wingers, please. Those of you who are redneck right-wingers, repent. So I'm not wanting to throw baby out with bathwater, but that notion of is very much a notion of equality, and in an area that most of us, I suspect, agree with. It therefore is a terrible injustice in our society that two men or two women who wanted to marry weren't allowed to marry, whereas a man and a woman who are allowed to marry are allowed to marry. There's an inequality. It's a justice issue. And I think, a moment's careful reflection, it's not a justice issue. Whatever issue it is, it's not justice. There's a lot of people who can't marry. You don't say it's an injustice that a father can't marry his daughter. It's not an injustice. It's we won't get into the particular debate, but the idea that So there is a distorted, twisted, selfish, individual, autonomous freedom idea of what justice is that we don't have to embrace. So we've got to be careful. It doesn't mean we don't jump on everybody. But I wouldn't say, therefore, Christian people oughtn't to be involved in any movements or any causes that haven't originated in the church. No, we ought to care about our neighbours. We ought to care about our society. We ought to care about the massive wrongs that are being done. It's just that what is to be done about them is so complicated. And, we need our best thinkers to be helping us to understand and not just jump on bandwagons. Either way, okay? Either side, okay? That's not particularly helpful at a practical level, but anyone want to make a comment on that? It's a big issue in our time, isn't it? It's a really big issue. The culture wars are something sort of about this, I think, this sort of thing. There's a new idea of justice that has taken over, and you can be deluded by the word. And by all means, criticise what I've said. I don't, it's not as though I've got any profound understanding. Yes, I think it.
How should we respond when the world's turned around and now we are the source of injustice?
Yeah.
As church leaders, how do we wisely respond to those kind of... I'm sorry.
You tell me. This is the issue of our time. And it's brand new to me. I've never seen it in my lifetime. And it's a long time, I can tell you. It's a long, long time. Where we are not the sort of goody-goody two-shoes who are on the high moral ground and lecturing to everyone else. No, we're the wicked ones. And so this new concept of justice, it's part of that. New concept of justice. We are the enemies of the highest moral good, as is now perceived today. The highest moral good. This is the theme that I'm hoping to tease out at the youth conference, Tim, with later on. The highest moral good, as far as I can see, in Australian thinking, mainstream thinking. I don't think it is mainstream thinking, but it's on the ABC and in the Sydney Morning Herald. So there you go. Is the freedom of the individual to do and to be whatever they want to do and be. And the Christian comes along and says, no, that's actually slavery. It's called slavery to sin. It's slavery to selfishness. And we've got a message that says that God has done something that will liberate you from your selfishness. How about that? That's liberation when you serve the Lord, but it's actually seen as slavery. So there's an upside down view of that. Now, I guess, first of all, we've got to do some careful thinking. We ought to recognise what we don't know and acknowledge what we don't know and understand. But there is a gospel here to be proclaimed, and it's the gospel that, stands against a really foolish, I don't know where it's going to lead, but it's not going to lead anywhere good, I don't think, this idea that the greatest good is the freedom of every individual to do and to be whatever they feel like and how they want to do and be, is a disaster. So, it's a disaster. The answers to it are not immediately obvious and easy, but the answers to it are there in the Scriptures. I'm sure of that. And one of the things I want to do more and more, as I see this notion of freedom, which is such a weird idea. People go to war for freedom, right? We actually send troops to war to die. And what are we fighting for? Freedom. Does anyone know what they're talking about? What is this freedom we're fighting for? What is it really? And the Christian concept of freedom is so rich and wonderful. We were giving more attention to what is freedom and proclaiming it, I guess. You got any thoughts to throw in on that? You asked the question, you must have been thinking about it, brother.
Look, I wonder if we need to be thinking of ways to talk about it and show people the end point.
Yes.
Of that way of thinking.
Yes.
In non-hot potato kind of topic terms.
Yes.
To then apply them to more, heated issues that are currently going. So you take it away from.
Yeah.
To help people get what we're saying, I think we need to not address the issues things that they can get together and go, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then see how the logic applies to the other situations. I haven't done it, but I'm just trying to.
This is a bit of a risk. I don't know whether this is a helpful thing to say or not. But along those lines, one of the thinkers that I think we ought to be listening to and thinking about, a number of us have talked about this over the last couple of days, is this Jordan Peterson character, who is an intellectual who I think is more a friend than an enemy, much more a friend than an enemy. He's not a Christian. Certainly not in our terms. I think he would actually describe himself as Christian, but he wouldn't mean the same thing as we mean. Many of you know who I'm talking about, a number of you don't, but he's a phenomenon. Millions, literally millions of people are listening to him, and he is critiquing the first public, that I've come across, public, substantial, intellectual critique of where our society is going. And his critique is thoroughly, deeply informed by Bible and by Christian thinking over the centuries, though it's complicated. I'm saying everything's complicated this morning, aren't I? He's a thinker. I won't try and explain all this, but his message is basically to, and literally millions of people are listening to him. Everywhere he goes, venues are sold out as he speaks. And you could sum up his message as, there's a whole lot more truth to Christianity than you realised. Point number one. He has summarised his message in these terms. That's point number one. Point number two, you really ought to take responsibility for the life that you're living. I can't remember what his other couple of points, summing it up, were. And there are Christian people who are really nervous and think he's dangerous because he's so close to us we can be deluded. He's not preaching the gospel. He's not doing that, and he's not giving teaching that flows out of the gospel. But he is helping to understand the problems with the world as it's going, particularly the Western world as it's going, in terms that I think can be really helpful to us. And apart from that, he's the most brilliant communicator I've seen for a long, long time. Okay, sorry, I shouldn't be plugging Jordan Peterson, but and discuss him with one another. What are we going to make of this guy who is so close to us, but he's not with us? We mustn't sort of get on the bandwagon and say he's our Messiah. He's not that. But I think he's got a lot to teach us because he's a very knowledgeable individual. Brother? Individual freedom, yep.
One of the really great things about the talks has been showing the high view of the Catholic Church and the people of God. But could you just maybe help to join the dots for me? Because I don't necessarily see how the movement from a centralised temple where the Spirit of God dwells in a central location, and then you move to the New Testament where you have a decentralisation and the privatisation of the Spirit. We are all indwelt as individuals now with the Spirit of God. I know that it leads to a high view of the church, but it could be misheard, I wonder, to saying that we now are free from that central kind of constraint of having to come together to practice our faith, because we now have the Spirit in us as individuals. So just how do we hold to a high view of the church?
Oh, mate, it's complicated. It's really easy to say. It's complicated. Yeah, no. Go.
Personal indwelling of the Spirit and obviously the way that doctrine is being kind of taken into
Yeah. The big thing that has happened, I think, with the gospel is that God's church is deinstitutionalised. It's not an institution. The New Testament does not set up an institution. We have set up institutions, and we've had to. You can't avoid it. And they're good and they're helpful in lots of ways, but we mustn't mistake them for the church. You all know that. So the church we've been speaking of is a group of people who have gathered and are meeting in the name of Jesus. I want to say that theologically speaking, there might be all sorts of other practical things, but the Bible study group in a home, the things we've been saying about church, or I've been trying to say about church, are true of that group of people. I don't, having said it's complicated, I don't think it is all that complicated, is it? That is, this is about salvation where God deals with the individual one by one. One by one the stones are brought to the cornerstone. But if the Spirit of God dwells in you, you will be drawn to others in whom that Spirit dwells. And it's just not possible for you to be a child of our Heavenly Father and have no interest in your brothers and sisters. Now, whatever, I won't, I don't think theologically, I can from a practical point of view, saying you really ought to be in church on Sunday, at our church on the corner of these two streets. That's where you've got to be in church. There are practical reasons to encourage people to do that, but I can certainly address the individualistic Christian who says, the Spirit of God dwells in me, I don't really need to meet with others. Well, the Bible says you do. And it says you do for very good reasons, because you're a family, we're a family, we need each other. There's all sorts of stuff we do for each other that we need, and that, there's all sorts of reasons for that, so we do need to come together. The form in which we have to come together has to be worked out at a practical level in this world. And whether it's the church service on Sunday, I've got all sorts of reasons I can argue with people that they ought to be there, but the person who happens to meet together with other believers in another context, I don't want... We who have responsibilities in the institution just need to be very careful that we don't overstate the significance of the institution that we're responsible for because we're so anxious. The theological truth, the spiritual truth of individual salvation will draw saved people together. You sort of want to say, how can it not? We share, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one body. So I just think that the reality will. And actually it does. You just imagine imagine living in a town that has never heard the gospel. You hear the gospel and you become a believer. And in a month's time, you hear that somebody else down the road has become a believer. Can you imagine not wanting to meet them? Can you imagine not wanting to spend some time with them? The reality is we will be drawn together by the Spirit that God gives us. Did you want to push that further? Yep. Okay. Steve, you've got you're running the agenda, I think, mate. You take no responsibility. Yeah, I understand. Okay, well done. Okay. I have no idea, but you've obviously just had a quick look through, and that sounds as though it could well be right. I mean, what is there to be joyful about after 1 Kings 11, for goodness sake? It's sort of all downhill with a few little bumps all the way to the exile, and the prophets are starting to tell you what's going to happen. That sort of joy you won't see again. When the people come back, return from the exile, I can imagine it makes perfect sense. Now, whether there were some momentary moments of joy in the story, I can't remember. I think just pop the vocabulary into your search engine and you'll find out. The joy of the Lord is your strength. The phrase coming from Nehemiah. Oh, Nehemiah. You come here and you study 1 Kings 8 so you know it, and they ask questions about Nehemiah 8. What's going on here? I don't know, mate. The joy of the Lord is your strength. It means what it says. I mean, is there anything subtle there? I mean, what strengthens you to live, to be a stable human being, to not despair, to face the stuff that life comes at you, but the joy that you have because you know God's goodness to you. But I'm just teasing out the phrase. The joy, I think it's a lovely phrase, a wonderful phrase, and telling one. Is that true? Is the joy of the Lord your strength, or is it your cleverness? Because your cleverness won't get you all that far, but the joy of the Lord will. And the joy of the Lord is not to be... it's an aspect of faith in the Lord, isn't it? You trust him. You trust him because he's good. Because he's good, you're overjoyed. Steve, you want to take that further? Up the back here.
I've always thought that was the motivation and strength comes from pleasing God. So it's his joy that he experiences as he sees his children growing and serving.
So the joy of the Lord being the Lord's joy, not our joy. Yeah, possible. Yeah. Does the context help you see whether we're talking about joy that we have in the Lord or the Lord's joy in us or in whatever? I took it the former sense, just hearing the words. I still feel inclined to take it that way, but I think I need to sit down and reflect on context to see whether there's anything to indicate one way or the other. The joy of the Lord is my strength. Yeah, I would have thought it as the joy that the Lord gives me. Yeah. Oh yeah. 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 Okay, I got nothing to add to that, guys. Anything else? Okay, Steve, you got the floor. Any more? Oh, wow. Wow, there we are. Anything else, friends? We're done. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Jeff, did you want to say a few words?